And sorry about that long introduction music. I was talking with Rick St. Germaine as he came in the studio here. We're getting things organized. In fact, I still got papers all over the place. Rick, you got to help keep me organized here. Joining me in the studio today is Rick St. Germaine, I don't know, the label is kind of the LCO historian. Do you accept that label?
Yeah, I've been doing that for quite a few years.
So a big anniversary is happening this year, um, the 100th anniversary of the flooding of Post, and I know there's a lot of Post surviving family members that are looking at putting together a remembrance commemoration event coming up on August 12th. But there's some other events happening in front of that, and let's start with really what happened, and let's educate our listeners, both native and non-native, who listen to this station about what happened 100 years ago this year.
So, Mark, we're honoring the 100th, the 100th anniversary of the flooding and the destruction of Pakwewong. It was a major village, a bustling village, just filled with all the signature items of the modern society.
Yeah,
100 years ago, back in the early 1900s, it was a bustling place. It had churches, it had stores, it had
schools.
trading post, school, it
Yeah,
had a jail. I mean, it had just tons of activity. It was a stopping place, a major stopping place,
mm,
both via the river and also a roadway that
yeah,
connected it between Hayward and Winter. You know, I talked to several people who actually rode wagons and on journeys from Hayward to Winter, and back in around the turn of the century, it was a bustling economy over there with logs rolling down the
yeah,
river and grain and feed and just seed and tons of things that were being transported back and forth. So the Huaywang was also known as the Pope, and it was a place where there was uh, lots of Native American people, most of whom spoke Ojibwe, but occasionally uh, the people who were moving on through with supplies would stop there and they'd sit around near some real tall red pine trees close to the Maday ground, and they would talk about developments that were happening either up in
mm,
Lake Superior or further south down along the Chippewa River, perhaps at all.
yeah,
So it was a pretty exciting place, and all this got destroyed 100 years ago. And so, and the, the government conspired with a number of corporate interests, and some of our congressmen went in cahoots.
yeah,
DIA, who was supposed to protect us, was really feeding us to the wolves, and we lost it. We fought against it. Soon there was major legislation that condemned over 5,000 acres of our
mm,
property and just destroyed our reservation. Not only did it inundate that major bustling small town village of Pakwewong, but also over at Chief Lake and places to the east. We had scattered homes located all around the riverway,
yeah,
which were inundated.
yeah.
And it was tragic. It
Now
was
you're
just,
saying there was uh, collaboration from a lot of these corporate people a couple of years before any of these discussions really started to happen.
well, it was more like 20 some years
20 some years.
before, yeah.
Okay.
And so it
Wow.
was a lengthy process. There were hearings that were required to be held by the federal government and the Congress that
Yeah.
required these hearings to be held with the tribal members. After all, what they were doing was violating uh, Article 13 and also preamble of the Treaty of 1854, which was
Mm,
sacred. It was a legal document. It was a foolproof contract between the Lakota tribe and the federal government. And it was the federal government that went and violated that treaty after they,
mm,
you know, uh, created this contract between the tribes
yeah,
and guaranteed those tribes their reservation lands and promised never to bother the reservation property. It's really a sad, uh, major benchmark in the history of our tribe. And I look back now, 52 years ago, a handful of tribal members fought hard, and Eddie Benton and Mike Trudeau. I could name a host of folks. We would meet on a regular basis and try to get something done about the effort of NSP at that time
yeah,
to relicense the lease on flooding the Chippewa flowers. So these are some things that we're looking back on in time. We look back 50 some years. We look back 100 years when people were actually driven out of their homes.
right, yeah,
So I remember 52 years ago, we fought hard and we were just looking back 50 years and saying,
right,
uh, all these horrible things happened to our people. And they got driven all over the place.
mhm,
And those folks didn't have a prayer. They were battling against the forces, corporate, multi-state corporate
sure,
interests.
yeah,
And, our people spoke of Ojibwe. They didn't know anything about the legal defense that was needed. There's
yeah,
many things that I want to talk about today. I want to also talk about, Mark, that we are having these events, big events on the reservation here up at Newport on July 21st. Now, that's about 5 days after the conclusion of Honor the Earth.
okay,
And also, at the Honor the Earth
yeah,
powwow,
right,
we're also having we're going to hold the powwow up and talk about those tragic events that occurred. And we can have a event there in which we're going to have educational materials
yeah,
to inform the powwow attendees that, of the circumstances, big flooding of our reservation.
mhm,
Also on August 12th, the descendants of the people that were driven out of their homes um, are going to hold a spiritual commemoration. And they're
sure,
going to do that right out on Church Island. And that's the closest we can get
okay,
to the village that was destroyed.
yeah,
And this is going to be a very honorable spiritual uh, ceremony that's going to be held there on the island. And they're going to be standing amongst graves,
mm,
the graves that were both dug up and the graves that remain there.
yeah,
And also they're going to be standing above the graves that were inundated by flooding of
right,
the reservoir.
yeah,
And it. I look back after 52 years and I just say, my God, the descendants are taking hold of this responsibility and they're doing it. They're just some
mhm,
tremendous people. Um, they're not only tremendous people, but they're informed people. They have the history from their ancestors, the
yeah,
people who were driven out, and those include Mark Fair and Tom Painter and Doreen DeBro and Dino Shogi and Tim DeBro, Deb Valentine, um, Amy Schmock, Elaine DeBro, Father Caroon, Sister Felissa. Believe it or not, um, Father Caroon and Sister Felissa are joining that group
mm,
every Wednesday night
mm,
at 5:30. They show up because their St. Anthony church was destroyed back in
mm,
1923, 100 years ago. and it was rebuilt up in the new village of
Yeah.
Newcoast as
Mhm.
St. Ignatius. I
Mm.
also want to mention that the planners who are working on um, the July 21st event, which is an educational and informative confab up in the village of Newcoast by the historic stone building. And those
Mm.
people include Faith Smith, Cheryl Path, Sylvia Brack. So we're
Yeah.
working together hand in hand with the descendants. And I should mention, I always mention the descendants and then I say, and Faith Smith. But Faith Smith is a descendant.
Oh, okay.
Her people were
Yeah.
driven out in several places. And I want to recognize these descendants because I'm so proud of them. I look back 52 years and I say, we didn't have this back then. And here we are now, 100 years, and I'm just beaming with pride at how these descendants have grabbed this event
Yeah.
and are marking the significance of the time. And
Are
they're
the
doing something about
yeah. Are the people you mentioned, are they, second generation descendants or,
it. They're
any
second and
first,
third, and
second or third? Yeah.
yeah.
Right.
But get this, Mark. You know, our tribe has we have a tradition of oral history, and those individuals have got that gift, and they've got
Wow.
the personal stories. And I'm just so pleased to see that they've done that. They've
Yeah.
carried out of the oral accounts.
Yeah.
And
I
a
was
guy like,
actually impressed with a couple of them. They were really prepared with, some research they did. They had books with maps in it and what it looked like back then, and so they've been doing their homework as to, discover what was maybe missing from their oral history, a little newer technology of maps and
one of
different
the things,
accounts.
that I note from our tradition is that there's um, there's a specter of humility and modesty among our tribal people. And those people up there, those descendants, are being modest.
Yeah.
They should get up to the bullhorn and they ought to
Yeah.
declare,
Yeah.
how, what happened to our tribe and all of our descendants. And yet, they're being modest. They at the planning meeting, they divulge this, they divulge that, they tell these personal stories that have been carried for dozens and dozens and dozens of years. And Phyllis DeGrow, their grandmother, she was
Mhm.
just a remarkable historian.
Yeah.
Oftentimes people say, Rick, you're the historian of the time. No, all I've done, Mark, is, and I say from the 1950s, because we really had an oral tradition. The elders of our tribe, our ancestors, they're the ones that were the historians. And they
Right.
really carried
Yeah.
on these stories from way back. And some of us people back in the 50s and 60s and 70s were lucky to,
Yeah.
be in their presence and hear all of this stuff.
Mhm.
I mentioned to the group that Ward Winton Sr., who was the attorney who stepped forward and volunteered his services to help the tribe when they had no one. They didn't have any legal
Yeah.
representation.
Right.
Here, Ward Winton Sr. was born back around 1880. He stepped forward because why? Because a uh, he was a descendant of the tribe. He had in his ancestry he had full blood native people who were his
Mm.
great grandparents.
Wow.
And so he stepped forward back in 1918 and 1919, and he represented LCO and fought, all of his heart. And I was lucky enough to sit and listen to him back in the mid and late 50s. Why? Because he was a friend of my mother, and apparently he had been a friend of my grandparents too.
Oh,
And
okay.
so my mother carried on. And Ward would come over to our cabin over the Ray Lake, and he would have dinner with us. He was just a remarkable. I'll say more about Ward when we get to these events. And his grandson, Ward Winton III, who has been an attorney at Hayward, is going
Oh,
to join us on that July 21st and share with us some accounts of his grandfather,
mm,
who did a wonderful thing for his tribe. I should
right.
mention that the Federated was his tribe,
Yeah.
and he defended us hot, hard. Recently, Ward III turned over his grandfather's legal documents back to the LCO museum. So
Mm,
I'm just
wow.
real happy that Ward III is going to help us out on the July 21st event.
Yep.
And I can't mention July 24th, 21st without mentioning also August 12th.
Yeah.
That, that's the spiritual event that's going to be held out at Fish Island. And there are going to be a flotilla of pontoon boats bringing people out. Now, the descendant planners, want to make sure that the descendants have a first opportunity on August 12th to go out there and take part in this spiritual ceremony that's going to be held out in
Mhm. Yeah.
church. So those are some of the things, Mark. I have much more to say. I want to
Well,
say a little
we
bit.
have a little bit more of time, and I just want to remind people that we're talking with, uh, as I call him, our LCO historian, Rick St. Germain, about the 100th anniversary, if you will, or commemoration of the flooding of Post. We did a live event back on March 15th at the casino where there was shared a lot of different pictures from what happened during that time, and we heard from some of the um, descendants of those people that went through that. What was that like? What was that experience for you on March 15th?
That was so heartening for me, Mark, because the descendants stood up and told some accounts. They gave some of those memorable accounts that were passed down from generation to generation.
Yeah.
Now, um, they have those descendants had grandparents and great grandparents who were still alive,
Hmm.
fortunately for them, and they were able to hear these personal stories. And one of the things we should do at these two events, at the July 21st and the August 12th event, we need to talk about those elders. I, some of my sources were Henry Smith, for example, not only Ward Winton Sr., who was our attorney back in 1918, but Henry Smith, who was tribal chairman back in the 50s
Mm,
and also even in the 60s. And Henry was just a lovable giant of both the old village and the new village. So, and he was a very quiet gentleman, but wow, was he filled with
mm,
history. And his descendants, of course, today have done so much for our tribe. I just can't tell you, when we first started the school in New Post back in 1975, his sons and his wife and kids stepped in and donated their time and
wow.
volunteered and just gave us this rich history, and that came right from Henry. Two of the people that were just uh, incredible sources of wealth of information
Hmm.
were Edwin and Connie Painter. They were brothers, and they were the great uncles of Tom Painter and others. I should mention, these individuals have a long list of descendants themselves. They have
Yeah.
great grandkids who number in the dozens. Annie Thomas was an incredible source back in
Mm,
the 70s when doing some of this history. I just can't say enough about Bill Baker Beneshi, who lived over there in 6 Mile, and he and I were real close, and we drove all over the place, even into Canada. But Bill was a wealth of information, and bless his heart. And we used to drive around, and we'd drive around the Florids, and he would just whip out names. I mean, the guy could he remembered these Ojibwe names, and he was just
Yeah.
rattling them off and describing their home and
Uh,
telling about their kids and just uh, telling really the heartbeat of our reservation. Sam Frog, who
mm,
was raised in Old Pope, and his father John and his mother Elizabeth, uh, they have oh, maybe a couple hundred descendants today, and
wow.
they had a home, and Sam grew up in that village, and his sister
Mhm.
Mamie. I can't tell you enough about the wealth of stories and just
Yeah.
painting a picture filled with the vibrancy of life. Phyllis DeBro, I, you know, she was the historian of us, really.
Mm,
She collected photos. She had accounts of families and homes. And uh, my dear friend and faith mother, E. Stewart, who adopted me as her son, she told me about ceremonies. She described the ceremonies in detail.
wow.
She described Augustin, who was probably the second most powerful medicine man, who she was selected to help.
Mm,
And he was driven out of the Chief Lake settlement. He had to go up into I just
mm,
Connie and Marie Pocat, they were the Riverside folks. They had that whole history on the east side of the Chippewa Village where we had, oh, I just can't tell you. There was George James, John James, uh, Agkiach, um, Siganag, Siganage, uh, Natamigiki, Golfway, Minogijik. I could go on and just name literally dozens of people who only had tribal names. And, I remember Connie and Marie telling me about their lives. And,
wow.
and they lived over there and they had little allotments and they were driven out. You know, we just don't pause and say, what did it feel like, to be removed from
Yeah.
the only place you and your parents and grandparents once lived and driven from your home.
And I wanted to comment that I learned at the earlier event on, March 15th that, the flooding people think of a flooding that happens, really quickly after a big rainfall, and all of a sudden we get flooded areas, and it's a sudden event. This event, when the dam gates were closed, this event took many months to happen, and many people stayed on their lands. They were
They
not going to
refused. Yeah,
leave at all whatsoever,
they refused.
and some of the other family members or native community had to go back with wagons and horses and pick these people up and tie them down and to bring them out of there because 3 days later all of a sudden they were realizing, hey, there's water surrounding my little farm that I have here, and they were stuck. And I remember one of the stories talking about the fear of the horses. They knew what was going on, and the screaming that the horses made when they had to bring these people out across flooded roads, and they were scared to death. And it was just an amazing thing that happened over months of time. This just didn't happen over a couple of days, and all of a sudden it was flooded.
The gates were closed on March 15th of 1923.
Yeah,
And that's why we held this commemoration event at the casino on March 15th
yeah,
earlier this year. And we just wanted to recognize that March 15th was when they
yeah.
closed the gates and the
Mhm.
waters began backing up and forming this one of the largest reservoirs in the state of Wisconsin.
Yeah.
The pristine Chippewa flowage. You know, today in our modern world in the 21st century, we look at the Chippewa flowage as an economic source of livelihood, a
Right.
natural resource that is rich and filled with fish and attracts tourists and so on. I talked to tourists up at the landing last summer, and when I told them this story, I think I almost made them cry, and and I and I worried about that, Mark, because we depend on these tourists too,
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
I made them feel bad, and so I had to switch. I had to quick say,
Yeah.
"Oh, wait a minute, no, we don't." We, don't-
Yeah. Right.
I saw the look on their faces as I was telling the story,
Uh,
and I said, "We want you back, because now we have this rich, wonderful lake, and you folks know how valuable it is as a
mhm.
fishery and a boating opportunity,
But
but
we still can't forget why it
no,
happened and how it happened,
right,
and from that point, it's yeah, it's
yeah."
just yeah, I look at the community now and it's, kind of thriving because of the reservoir that was created. In fact, many people fish these waters in their traditional ways. They're out spearfishing early in the season, and a lot of them are out on the flowage and other lakes that are surrounded by this area. And so this is their livelihood as well.
So, Mark, if we're on video, this is what the flowage used to look like. It was just a series of
Yeah,
tributaries of streams and rivers, and it was just winding around this
yeah.
hilly area. And those waterways were filled with wild rice. There was thousands
Oh,
and thousand acres of pounds of finished wild rice that the tribe depended upon
mm,
in those riverways. And when the water was rising in the summer of 1923, those rice beds were destroyed.
yeah,
And, our purpose for being here was gone. Right before our eyes, we
sure.
lost, a major source of our economy
And
and our
all the deer
livelihood.
hunting lands that were there
Yes,
in the hills.
right.
Yeah,
And we had wild cranberries, we had blueberry bugs, we had just uh, major sources of foodstuffs for our
right.
people,
Yeah,
and it was gone, practically in an instant. It did take all summer to fill, and you were telling that story that Connie and Edwin Tainer told me about their grandmother Poshkin,
okay.
and I just you know. I'm not going to say much about it, but there were tears in their eyes when they were
Yeah,
telling that story. And I mean, I
yeah.
was sitting there choking up myself
Powerful
when they
story.
told that story of how they had to forcefully remove their grandmother,
Yeah.
and she wanted to die. She refused to leave her little cabin, and the water was coming up to the doorstep, and she just wanted to stay in there and die. And
Mhm.
she had been removed several places, and her life was tragic. And somebody ought to write a book about her. She was the
Yeah.
daughter of Nanangabi, our greatest chief,
Mm,
and so Paskin was this incredible woman, and she somebody ought to write a book about her sisters too. They were also incredible, but her story of being actually bound up and forcefully removed to save her life. There are other stories like that. There
yeah.
were elderly people who just refused to leave, and the water was coming up to their ankles. And I I just think sometimes that in our modern life we just gloss over these things. And I'm so proud of the people back in 1970 and 1971. We had a committee back there that fought against the relicensing of the Chippewa flowage and the
Oh,
Winter Dam. And we had a pretty thriving committee. And again, I want to give credit to Mike Tribble and Eddie Benton and just a host of others, Jim White and his wife, Mary, and um, also Marilyn Tribble. I could just go on and name a host of John Chambers. There was just a bunch of us who
yeah.
fought against the relicensing. And and that's when we resorted to occupying the dam, and there was some harrowing evenings there. There was a handful of us who were camping out
Sure.
on the dam,
Yeah.
and there was gunshots going on over our head. There were low flying uh, Piper Cubs flying over us during the daytime,
Hmm.
and we were listening to these battery powered radios to find out what was happening. And local radio stations were warning people below the dam uh, that those helpless people of us who were occupying dam had
Yeah.
already wired the dam with explosives, and we were getting ready to blow it up.
Oh my.
And we just sat out there and laughed, and when we heard that on the radio, and
Yeah.
I thought, gee, I don't know the first thing about dynamite.
Wow.
I wonder I wonder how we did that.
Mhm.
Nonetheless, um, there was lots of people joined in that protest, and we look back on that time, and all of us now are gray-haired, and that was 50 some years ago, and
Yeah.
we were fighting for those people who were driven out back in 1923.
Mhm.
So I just I just want to remind the people that there's a big event occurring on July 21st. It's going to be a sacred commemoration. It's going to be held in a huge circus tent next to the stone building, the old historic stone building
Oh, okay.
up in New Post. And that'll be like 5 days after the Honor of the Earth. We're going to have food up there. We'll have some transportation. We've got planners that are working on that right
Yeah.
now.
Right.
And also the spiritual event that's going to be held on August 12th. And this is the one where we're going to have, I call it a flotilla of pontoon boats
Mhm.
to ferry people over to Church Island, which is sacred. And they're going to have a sacred ceremony out there to remember the hundreds of people that were driven out of their homes by the Wisconsin Minnesota Light and Power Company, which eventually evolved into NSP and is now known as Excel.
Yeah.
And that big corporate giant, again, they lobbied and won the federal legislation that drove us out of there, stole our land and desecrated our reservation, and um, and just did an injustice. And I sometimes wonder, when do we look back historically and just recognize the wrongs that have been done to our reservation?
Yeah.
Our people were removed. We were driven out of Wisconsin back in 1852.
Mm.
And again, here in 1923, again, we're driven out of our lands. It's just, there's no stop, you know,
Yeah.
uh, no stop to the injustice, it seems like at times. But we're going to do something about it this summer. We're not going to let this thing go away. We're going to talk about our history. And again, I just want to say so much for the descendants in New Post: Tom Tainter, Mark Thayer, Doreen DeBro, Tim DeBro, Dino Shogi, Deb Valentine. Um, Looking at my notes here, Deanie Schmock, Elaine DeBro, and
Mm.
Father Caroon, Sister Felissa, Faith Smith, Sylvia Bracklin, Carol Pfaff, and there's more.
Yeah.
I wish I had all the names, but these folks are working hard, and I just am so pleased to see the work that they're putting in. You can't imagine the details that go into putting an event like
Yeah.
this.
Right. Yeah.
I should say, too, that Saint Ignatius Church in New Post is planning an event on June 25th, and Father Caroon and Sister Felicia are the people that are really organizing that event up there. And it's to recognize the loss of their St. Anthony Church out in the Old Post Village.
Yeah.
We forget about the things. We also should mention that um, several medicine lodge societies were destroyed when the flowage was
Mm,
flooded. And we had a medicine lodge society, a thriving medicine lodge society. There, I should mention, there were hundreds of graves that were inundated by this
yeah.
huge reservoir and just desecrated. Uh, the power company made an attempt to remove some of the graves. Some of the graves were removed, but you know, looking back on my years, I was on the tribal council and tribal chairman back in the 70s and 80s, and our conservation wardens used to be alerted that bones were washing up along the shore out there near Church Island,
Mm,
Moonshine Bay, and Mark, it's just detestable to think that our graves, that our ancestors, that could have been somebody's mother, and that could have been,
yeah,
a brother or sister of people.
yeah.
And when these things happened, I just can't tell you how people, the pain in their hearts, when the bones were washing up along the shores out there. And
Mm,
then we had to reinter those bones.
yeah.
Pipe Mustache, our venerable spiritual leader, would reinter those remains.
Okay.
There's so much more to say, Mark. I
Yeah.
know we're getting close to the time, but
Oh, we're
um,
going. I wanted to note again, people to mark on their calendars this August 12th event because it's uh, it's going to be significant, and I would preliminarily they have scheduled some events to happen at a certain time, but the main gathering in New Post at the community hall is going from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. and it's kind of just an open house sort of thing where people will have speakers and photos, information displays, and other things available there. So there's going to be, a pretty significant gathering and display. And then there's a traditional dinner that happens at 5 o'clock or so. These are all kind of preliminary time schedules, but the 12th is the big event. And I would venture to say that native and non native community members would gain a lot by just appearing and seeing what was happening there. Again, not to uh, prevent them from using the resources today that are there, but just to be aware what's below the water line. And there's a rich, rich history. In fact, I've heard even that there's a chimney, I think, from the school that's still visible when the water's low enough. You can see these structures, so people don't realize what's there. And I almost sometimes wonder what would we find if we drained it just for a day or whatever it takes. What would you find below the water?
yeah, you would find some of the remains of some of the houses. You certainly would find some rocks and things that served as foundations,
Yeah,
and you would find
other
items
tools,
like
wagons.
desks have been found out there from the school.
Yeah,
Items in the trading post. I mean, Mark there has been very active at low tide in the wintertime when the water does go down.
yeah,
And I've heard so many stories of people that have gone out there and looked over the site of the old village. People don't realize how low the water gets in the wintertime. It just practically drains. There are some small ponds.
mm,
In 1970 and 71, one of the reasons we were fighting against relicensing the flowage was the damage that was being done to the fishery every time those waters go down.
oh, yeah,
They go down way low and form small ponds. And nobody really thinks about what is being done, the effects of erosion on our islands. We own islands out there,
yeah,
and we have property, about 4,500 acres that we gained from NSP in a settlement that was done
hmm,
in 1984. I I just think that there's so much history to know about, and that's what we're going to do.
that's what it's about. Yep.
Yes, we're gonna provide that history, and it's gonna be an educational event on July 21st,
Yeah.
and that's on a Friday, Mark, and we're hoping the tribe gives that day off so that they can join us up there near the
Mhm.
stone building in New Post
Yeah.
on the 21st of July.
And we mentioned that the, Honor the Earth tribe, the powwow and homecoming and celebration, we'll be dedicating some time to that. I'm on the powwow committee, because I work with the audio video stuff, and I know that, Willard mentioned that they wanna have it they're dedicating this year's powwow in remembrance of Post, and, that's one of the themes that's coming out for the powwow itself,
Yeah,
is to remember Post. And there's going to be some time set aside for someone to talk about this history and educate the younger people that are there that have no idea, what might be out there except from what they hear from their grandparents or parents. There's generations that both native and more particularly non-native uh, generations of people who've never heard about this history, and because it's not in the history books, at least in the non-native history books, it's kind of like you said, glossed over, and people think, oh well, it's under the water, we'll just forget about it.
yeah.
It's
Well,
wow,
we're
it's
tribal
amazing.
people, and those are things we don't forget about. You know,
Mm.
we really have a rich heritage, and one of the things we do is we look back and remember, the generations of time that people have harbored these stories and just prayed that they be carried on. We have our own school, we have our own
Hmm.
university. We have so many young people that need to hear these stories. So
Yeah.
my hope is that um, that we take the time and learn much more about our own personal history here as a tribe.
Yeah. Very good. Well, it is we still have a few minutes things here, and we'll discuss more. This will come up more often here on WOJB and through other streaming activities. So, Rick, thank you for joining us tonight. Today, not tonight. Today here on WOJB.